At dusk we found ourselves in front of a broad lowland. I pondered whether we should have risked leading the battle group into the snow-covered valley. Judging from the map, the valley must have been 1,000 meters wide and 50 meters lower than the surrounding terrain. On the other side of this obstacle was a village. We had to get to it if we didn't want to be completely snowed in. A few men on skis were sent out to scout. Wenche and I were with our advance guard, awaiting the return of the reconnaissance. When it returned, we would find out if we could move through the snowy valley. Hiding behind snowdrifts, we were moving forward when the guard suddenly excitedly pointed straight ahead and whispered, "Tank." He was right. Then we heard the deafening roar of an engine. The tank must have traveled up the slope several hundred meters directly in front of us. Our lead tank was immediately given a warning. The gunner had his hand on the trigger, ready to fire. We waited silently for the Soviet tank. There he was. I could see him. It was creeping slowly up the slope. Max Wenche whispered, "Jesus Christ, he's turning the turret right at us. Don't you see the cannon?" Suddenly, the guard laughed loudly. In front of us was a huge bull, whose head we mistook for the tank's turret, and whose horns were the gun barrel. The blizzard played a funny joke on us. Despite the bitter cold, we laughed heartily. In another hour, we knocked the Red Army men out of their warm dwellings and occupied the village. It was only 6 p.m., but a very dark night descended on us, allowing us to recognize neither friend nor foe. The vehicles and tanks advanced slowly. The darkness excluded all orientation. We were stuck among the units of the 6th Russian Guards Cavalry Corps. Our artillery and supplies were cut off from the main forces of the battle group. The invading enemy split the marching column into two halves. Artillery took a circular defense. I learned by radio that the attacking enemy units were already 25 kilometers west of us and went to storm Krasnograd. In Krasnograd, there were already troops of the SS Grenadier Motorized Regiment Thule of the 3rd SS Panzer Division Deadhead. It was hastily thrown into the breakthrough to prevent the enemy's advance. The main forces of this division were still riding in echelons on the railroad between France and the Dnieper. Two reinforced regimental battle groups were fighting hard east of Kharkov. The forces of the Germans defending Zmiev could not compete with the large masses of attacking Russians who were supported by strong artillery. Our own shallowly echelon defense at Rogin east of Kharkov held back the unusually powerful attacks of the Russians, supported by ever-new forces, constantly pulled up to the battlefield. There was no longer anything human in this battle. It was brutal, and the most inhumane methods were used. The Soviets committed horrific acts of violence against captured soldiers at Rogani airfield. After a German counterattack, 50 dead SS men were found here. 10 had their eyes gouged out, and 1 had his genitals cut off. With few exceptions, there were terrible burns on their bodies. 10 were completely burned and charred. Following the capture of Belgorod, the enemy army also deepened into the area northwest of Kharkov. By February 13, the left flank of Kharkov's defense stretched on the section Russky-Tishki, the northern part of Russkaya Lozovaya, railway station Emptsov, Fesky. A battalion of motorized infantry on Leibstandard, armored personnel carriers, under the command of Jochen Piper, managed to establish contact with the 320th Infantry Division east of Zmiev and destroy the enemy groups that had broken through to the south. The remnants of the 320th Infantry Division were completely exhausted and left a miserable impression. More than 1,500 wounded men still survived the hardship of the march through the terrible blizzard and were immediately transported to the rear where they were taken care of. The long, starving division was fed at the Leibstandard. The avalanche of advancing Soviet troops was rolling further and further west and approaching Dnipropetrovsk. The entire front of the German Army Group South was under threat. As a result of this development of events, I received the order to move in the direction of Alexievka and block the way of the enemy advancing westward. The blizzard on the Kharkov front was still raging, clogging the optics of our tanks with snow. The Russian troops and my battle group were moving past each other. In the middle of the afternoon, a scout plane circled above us and dropped a message attached to a smoke bomb. All around us were advancing Soviet troops. 24 hours later, we reached Alexeyevka and moved to a circular defense. At this point, we were the easternmost unit on the Kharkiv front. Would the battle group be able to fulfill its task? It was left to itself, almost without artillery, tanks, and supplies. The settlement was quite large. It stretched on both sides of the road. Meanwhile, while scouting the area, we came across a Russian sentry and opened fire from a distance of no more than 5 meters. A snowstorm made visibility nil. SS Obersturmführer von Ribbentrop collapsed a few steps to my right. A bullet that had punctured a lung had knocked him to the ground. But the next morning, Ribbentrop's condition was not bad. He refused to be evacuated to safety at Storch as long as there was at least one wounded soldier in the cauldron. Soviet troops rushed in a stream past us on both sides of the settlement. I was glad to hear Max Wensch's report on the situation. He was making his way toward us with armored vehicles, artillery, and supplies. We hoped he would arrive in time. We needed fuel and ammunition urgently. On the morning of February 13, the SS Motorized Corps received the Führer's orders to hold Kharkiv at all costs. Following this, during the night of February 13, in order to release some reserves, the defense front around the city was further reduced. The new frontier of Kharkiv defense lay along the line Lizogubovka, Bolshaya Danilovka. However, by the evening of February 13, the Corps' headquarters reported that the new line could be held only until February 14 because the city was already surrounded. At midnight, it was ordered to blow up all warehouses, as well as military installations and everything suitable for the military economy. In the morning, Soviet troops managed to break through the shallowly echeloned line of our defenses north of Zaitishia. An attack by 40 enemy tanks near Rogan also resulted in a breakthrough. A strike on the area of the tractor factory was also feared. We also lost Olshiny northwest of Kharkiv. This allowed the Russians to keep under fire the main supply line, the railroad and highway from Poltava to Kharkiv. Soviet troops continuously attacked the southern and extreme eastern points of the Kharkiv defense line and threatened to overturn us at Alexeyevka. We hit several anti-tank guns and inflicted great damage to the enemy infantry during the counterattack in the direction of the village of Barika, but our ranks were thinning. SS Hauptsturmführer Nittel, commander of the Mobile Patrol Company, was wounded for the 4th time in these battles. The night attacks of the Russians were especially dangerous because we could not see the enemy creeping up and had to conserve ammunition. The enemy broke through to Alexeyevka on the night of February 13 to 14 and pushed us to the center of the village. The battle reached its climax. The soldiers fought with courage, coming from despair, but soon it became clear that there was nowhere to retreat. In this hopeless situation, events unfolded rapidly. Positioned close to each other, our armored vehicles opened hurricane fire, firing bursting shells at the attacking Soviet troops. Houses with thatched roofs went up in flames. We were in the middle of a ring of fire and were firing in the dark at the brightly lit ranks of the Russians. Their attack was thwarted. With our counterattack, we drove them back from Alexeyevka and returned to our former positions. About the same time, Witt's regiment attempted to make contact with our battle group by making a breakthrough from the north. However, north of Barika, Witt encountered such strong Soviet resistance that he was unable to break through to Alexeyevka. As dawn broke, we saw new Red Army preparations east and west of the village. If both attacks were deployed simultaneously, our fate would be sealed. I went around the position and talked to almost every soldier. Everyone huddled together to form a stronghold. Machine guns ringed the anti-tank guns. My young soldiers jokingly responded to my greeting. We did not feel defeated in any respect. The superiority of the Russians hardly bothered us, but the lack of fuel, the loss of mobility, and the palpable lack of ammunition drove us almost to despair. We had been promised to drop a load of supplies for the past 48 hours, but I had not yet seen any of our planes. The weather conditions made such a supply impossible. I again sent a situation report and demanded an urgent delivery of ammunition. At the same time, Wunsch's group was breaking through closer and closer to Alexivka. Would Wunsch succeed? I was shocked as I stood in the classroom of the local school among my wounded soldiers. They knew what was happening and begged me not to let them fall into the hands of the Russians. We remembered the terrible end of the German field hospital at Feodosia in the Crimea. It fell for a time into the hands of Soviet soldiers who landed in the city from the sea in January 1942. The wounded were thrown naked out of the windows, and then water was poured on them. More than 300 frozen bodies were discovered in the hospital yard after it was recaptured during the German counteroffensive. Dr. Guttering shrugged his shoulders, shook his head, and turned away. The voices of my soldiers were tearing at my heart. What was I to do? The young soldiers looked at me with relief when I told them to issue pistols to the wounded. I was ready to stand in the fire of the conflagration to avoid having another conversation like that. The clouds hung low in the sky. We heard the noise of engines. From the roar of the engines, we could guess that we were being searched for. Suddenly, we noticed the shadow of a Heinkel 111. Would it bring us salvation? A few minutes later, the shadow was above us again. The airplane was flying directly over Alexivka. Soon containers of ammunition and fuel were falling from the sky, but unfortunately only a few remained intact. Most exploded on impact with the ground. At this point, I lost all hope. The fuel that survived intact was immediately distributed to self-propelled guns, tanks, and armored vehicles. If we were to die, we wanted to die in battle, breaking through the steppe in our fighting vehicles, so that the Russians would have a hard time. We would not surrender to them without a fight. Having finished compiling a report on the situation, in which I reported on the imminent death of the combat group, I said goodbye to the soldiers, who together with me went to meet their fate. I looked at the faces of my soldiers in some amazement. There seemed to be curiosity in the expression of their relaxed faces. There was not a single face whose features were distorted by fanaticism. They were seriously listening to my words. I identified the target of the attack and climbed into my armored vehicle. Are we all going together for our final attack? We slowly advanced from the center of the village, past the ruins and graves of our comrades, to the outskirts of the village. A few hundred meters in front of us, Red Army soldiers were scurrying back and forth. They could afford such freedom of movement, since we had almost no artillery at our disposal and ammunition was scarce. The Soviets did not seem to believe in the possibility of our counterattack. In the meantime, noon had come. The blizzard had subsided. A few timid rays of sunlight slipped overhead. What would the Russians do in our rear when we attacked eastward? Our armored vehicles were on a road that led right through the very middle of a cluster of Russian troops. I intended to drive full speed down this stretch of road and hit the Soviets, aiming our armored vehicles right into the center of the enemy positions. We could only succeed in a lightning strike against the Soviets and gain at least 24 hours for ourselves. I hoped that in that 24 hours I could deal with the Russians west of Alexivka, and believed that Wunsch would be able to break through by then. My little Cossack, a Russian volunteer who had accompanied me from Rostov and was loyal to me, pointed out a group of Soviet soldiers behind me. Dark dots were visible everywhere. We were, figuratively speaking, sitting up to our necks in shit. Only a few seconds separated us from starting to move into total obscurity. My driver lightly pressed the gas pedal, released the clutch, and the armored car slowly moved. Assault guns roared forward on both sides of the road, leaving behind the ruins of village houses. The speed of our movement increased. Armored personnel carriers with motorized infantry and armored cars rushed ahead of the self-propelled guns, which covered them with fire. Our armored vehicle was the lead vehicle. Speed was our weapon against the Russians. Bullets fired from machine guns rattled the armor in a hail. I saw only an endless road ahead and tried to increase my speed. The tracks of armored personnel carriers and self-propelled vehicles whipped into the air columns of snow dust, which resembled the splashes of water from the bow of a destroyer, cutting through the waves. We, having built a wedge, crashed into the waves of attacking Russians, deeply wedged into their ranks. The fire of Russian heavy mortars covered the road ahead of us. Forward, and only forward. There should be no stopping at this point. We had to destroy the attacking orders, or we were all facing a meeting with the devil. A particularly strong blow to the armor made the muscles in my entire body tense up. The odor of burning smoke hit my nostrils. The second blow, which hit the armored vehicle with incredible force, forced it to stop. Our driver, SS Lieutenant Fernebelum, screamed wildly. Flames rose up around my body. I jumped out of the turret and lay down in a deep caterpillar track together with Cossack Michael. The screams from the armored vehicle were driving me crazy. I crawled along the rut, intending to help our driver. He must have caught on something inside the car with his thick winter clothes, because his hatch was open. Suddenly, I was grabbed firmly by my leg. Michael dragged me backward and shouted, "Get back. The commander is more important to the unit. Get back." "I'll get my comrade." The Cossack jumped into the burning car, pulled the driver out and rolled him in the snow. At that time, we were hit by mortar and machine gun fire. Clinging tightly to the ground, we crawled back along the caterpillar track. We were picked up by the advancing soldiers. Only then I was convinced that we had overturned the attacking orders of the Soviet troops, and the Soviet infantry were scattering in different directions. Unfortunately, we could not build on this success because there was less and less fuel left, and another Soviet assault group had taken up positions to attack from the opposite side. After we returned to Alexeyevka, we found that Michael had been hit in the neck from behind by shrapnel, while our driver had not been seriously wounded, but only suffered minor burns. The noise of the battle west of Alexeyevka brought us into a joyous excitement. This noise could only mean that Max Wensch's offensive was successful, and so it was. The tank battalion had broken through the dense enemy orders, bringing us large quantities of ammunition and fuel. We were once again a fully operational unit, and on orders from the division, we fought our way out of the encirclement the next morning. As we made our way westward, we were introduced to a new phase of this inhumane war. Soviet soldiers were indistinguishable from harmless civilians. For the first time, enemy soldiers were ambushing us in towns and in the countryside, when regular military units could not be recognized. We became nervous. The locals did not dare to give away the Red Army soldiers disguised as civilians. The enthusiasm of the advancing Soviet troops and the attitude of the population demanded special vigilance on our part. My old comrade Fritz Montig, who was assigned to act as commander of the headquarters company, was hit by mines and had both legs torn off below the knee. When he was brought to me on a motorcycle with a sidecar, he was still fully conscious. A few days later he died and was buried in Poltava next to General von Briesen. The fighting was acquiring an insidious character. Meanwhile, the situation around Kharkov had become disastrous. Against all common sense, the city was ordered to be held. Since the requests of the SS motorized corps to abandon the city were rejected, the commander of the corps, General Hosser, decided to issue his own withdrawal order in order to prevent encirclement and give them freedom of maneuver for the necessary counteroffensive. The enemy units that had broken through on the eastern section of the front from the southeast reached the northeastern outskirts of Kharkov on February 14. Piper's battalion of motorized infantry, which launched an immediate counterattack, engaged in a fierce night battle with the Russians, unable to clear the area of the constantly pulling up enemy forces. In the town itself, the inhabitants began to assist the advancing Russians. Along the way, our columns came under fire from the houses. In this situation, the SS Motorized Corps Strike Group was ordered to stop the attack in the southern direction and hold the occupied territory. The Corps was to withdraw the troops defending Kharkov and send a tank unit to the northwest to repel the enemy-occupied Olshiny. This order could not be carried out, because to accomplish this task with the existing state of the roads only to concentrate and move troops required 2 days. Corps Commander General Hosser that evening once again outlined the situation to get the order to abandon Kharkov. On the night of February 14 to 15, the enemy broke through our battle orders in the northwestern and southeastern parts of the city. The tank battalion of the 2nd Grenadier Motorized Division of the SS Reich was able to inflict heavy damage on the attackers during a counterattack in the northwestern direction. The enemy offensive was temporarily halted. The SS Motorized Corps Command once again reported the seriousness of the situation to the Army Command. By noon on February 15, no decision had still been made. Using the last opportunity, at 12:50 p.m. on February 15, the Corps Commander, General Hosser, ordered the 2nd Grenadier Motorized Division, Reich, to abandon its positions and fight its way to the northern part of the city in order to prevent the encirclement of 1.5 German divisions there. With the support of armored vehicles of the Reich Division, these units managed to break out of the encirclement and fight their way through the city and further south. This decision was reported to Army Group South and Army Headquarters at 13.00. General Hosser joined the fighting units. At 16.30, the order came again with the demand to hold the defense at all costs. General Hosser's reply was as follows: "The matter is settled. The troops are being evacuated from Kharkov." Thanks to General Hosser's decision, thousands of people remained alive or avoided years of captivity. Moreover, it made it possible to create a more or less dense front line of defense southwest of Kharkov. The rearguard of the 2nd Company of the Grenadier Motorized Division of the SS Reich Grenadier Motorized Division fought its way through the city on February 16. Counteroffensive. The operation could be considered a success, if only because the encirclement of 1.5 divisions was prevented by the abandonment of Kharkov, and we were now able to hold the defense along a much shorter front line. The decisive significance of our retreat from Kharkov, however, was that a large part of the SS Motorized Corps could now be freed up to attack in a southerly direction, to link up with the counterattacking troops of Army Group South, to which we were now subordinate. The situation on the northern edge of the Donbass developed as follows. The enemy flanked Army Group South at Slaviansk with large forces of tank and rifle units of General Popov, and steadily advancing to the Dnieper through Pavlograd and Novomoskovsk. The enemy's advance units had already advanced almost to Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporozhye, and on the left flank of the offensive to Krasnoarmeyskoye. On the Dnieper at our disposal, almost no combat-ready compounds remained. Steinbauer's group, the personnel of which was represented by furloughed soldiers and remnants of broken combat units, was transferred from Dnipropetrovsk to Novomoskovsk and covered the western outskirts of the latter. The enemy had already occupied the eastern part of the city. In Dnipropetrovsk unloaded the 15th Infantry Division, which sent a regimental task force to cover Sinelnikov, the left wing of the Russian 6th Army, whose strong formations took up positions opposite the front line of the division. Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler had already begun to encircle the SS Motorized Corps. The advanced Russian units had already crossed the Krasnograd-Novomoskovsk road leading to the south. The troops of this grouping were rushing westward. Other Russian forces were targeting Dnipropetrovsk. Immediate countermeasures were for Army Group South, a matter of life and death. Following the retreat from Kharkov, 2 SS divisions were able to be redeployed. The 2nd SS Grenadier Motorized Division Reich concentrated on the right flank of the corps near Krasnograd, and on 19 February moved northeast to counter the enemy onslaught. During the gradual withdrawal of its left flank, the 1st Grenadier Motorized Division of the SS Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler remained on the previously established front line, supporting the Ross Army Corps. It provided indirect support to the Reich in its offensive, conducting localized attacks on its section of the front and pulling back the Russian forces. Our troops gained a second wind. At last the days when we were only retreating were over, and the time for the counteroffensive had come. The gravity of the situation and the importance of the upcoming battle were clear to every soldier. My battle group was ordered to replace the motorized infantry battalion on Piper armored personnel carriers at Yeremivka and cut off any further Soviet advance here. We were advancing through the positions held by Kross's battalion. It had entrenched itself in widely dispersed strongholds along the front line. The battalion had to hold a defense strip at least 5 kilometers wide. We solved the problem by destroying the Soviet units that had broken through these strongholds during the day, and in the evening we set up wire barriers between the strongholds, covered by fire. I, along with Jock and Piper, took 10 kilometers of the actual front line. Piper captured the village of Yeremivka after a fierce battle and had to hand over to me the forward bastion of our defenses formed as a result of his attack. Several T-34 tanks that had been hit served as wind protection in the cold blizzard that constantly rained down from the east on our forward posts. Jock and Piper briefly outlined the situation to me and drew my attention to the active movement of troops east of Yeremivka. It looked like the Soviets were preparing to attack. In the icy cold, we had turned Yeremivka into a real stronghold. From here, I was going to lead out units of tanks and armored vehicles of the battle group in lightning raids against the advancing Soviet troops. We found strong Russian units and formations moving south of our position toward Krasnograd and leaving only weak barriers against us. From our forward observation posts, we could trace the route of the Russian columns in great detail. The reinforced Russian regiment passed us and headed for Krasnograd. He put up only a weak guard against us. It was a direct challenge for us. We had to attack. The next day, as soon as it began to dawn, the battle group moved south. It left only artillery, supply, and tank fighters in the stronghold. We left the stronghold unnoticed by the enemy. The overcast weather favored our intentions. Our artillery put a diversionary fire on known positions east of Yeremivka to mislead the enemy as to our true intentions. Our column was barely recognizable among the snowy expanse. Each vehicle was covered with white camouflage paint, and the soldiers wore white camouflage or white winter uniforms. We moved quickly, snaking across the rugged terrain. The battle group stopped at a small rise. Enemy columns were continuously moving in a westerly direction. A village stretching along the road swallowed up another column of Soviet troops, and it disappeared from view. About 1,000 meters still separated us from the Soviets. Should we take advantage of this and rush to attack along this slightly sloping road? The Red Army had been marching westward for nearly 24 hours. Would their superiority be too great? Would we not run to the protection of our anti-tank guns? I stood in the vanguard of the battle group together with Wunsch, the tank battalion commander, and the company commanders of the 1st SS Reconnaissance Battalion, and chose the best way to attack. Considering speed to be our best weapon, as I had in other situations before, I intended to cut into the thick of the Soviet troops with the company of the 1st SS Reconnaissance Battalion. Several tanks would cover the company with fire. The company would cut off half of the Soviet marching column and drive it westward. A squad in an amphibious vehicle volunteered to act as the lead unit. The young soldiers knew what they were getting into. Almost certainly the flanks of the enemy column on the march were covered by mines. In a few minutes, everyone was ready to attack. Wheels and tracks, twisting in the snow, hooked on the ground, and cars at full speed with a roar rushed to the outskirts of the village. It was necessary to cross the open space at such a speed that the enemy had no time to take countermeasures. The fighting vehicles rushed down the slope like an avalanche from the mountains. Tanks moved to the left and right of the road and shelled the Soviet troops. The fire from heavy mortars increased the effect of the tanks. I was in the lead company when the first amphibious vehicle blew up, and the soldiers who were in it fell to the ground with torn and shattered limbs. The second amphibious vehicle stood at the head of the column without hesitation or hitch. It, too, was almost immediately literally blown to pieces. The company flew through the places of explosions with an arrow. Our comrades literally paved the way for us, and we broke through the mine barrier. Both amphibious drivers with severed limbs lay in the snow along with the less seriously wounded machine gunners. Their platoon leader had also lost both legs. We couldn't help the wounded, but the company following behind took care of them. The Soviets had left the village street in great haste and were rushing into houses or seeking escape in flight. Our machine guns mowed them down in the white, snow-covered fields. Their supporting artillery was crumpled by our tanks, thrown aside, or knocked into a heap. The defeat was indescribable. Several tanks sent shell after shell into the column marching westward. They turned its soldiers into a disorderly rout. The column was crushed by the attacking tanks like a giant fist. Once again, speed proved itself a terrible force. There were hardly any Russian anti-tank guns left to withdraw and change position. All the crumpling underneath the tracks of the heavy tanks crushed most of them. We swept through the long-stretched village in a matter of minutes, and the path of the enemy advance became a road of misery. Broken steel mingled with the flesh of the oxen that served as draft power for the anti-tank guns. The pursuit continued beyond the outskirts of the village. The Soviet troops were taken by surprise. They did not realize how a fatal blow could be delivered to them from behind. A column of Soviet troops fell victim to our surprise frantic attack. A damaged German tank stood between the last few houses of the village. It had been hit by a Russian anti-tank gun not more than 150 meters away in an orchard. The infantry was already engaged in destroying the gun when a machine gun line ran between us. In a flash, we took cover behind the tank. However, Franz Roth, the ubiquitous war correspondent, did not have time to do so. The bullet hit him in the chest. We dragged him to cover and carried him to a small hut, where he was immediately attended to by Dr. Guttering. Roth died a few days later in a field hospital. He was one of our best correspondents. The next village caught fire from our tracer shells. Red Army men were fleeing for their lives and dying under machine gun fire. The pursuit continued all the way to the next village, where we also turned the Soviet troops to flight. The combat equipment and armament of the defeated columns were turned into a pile of rubble. The danger to our southern flank was temporarily eliminated. As darkness fell, we returned, tired, to our stronghold. The destruction of the Russian marching column had cost us 2 dead and several wounded soldiers. The swiftness of the operation, the use of opportunity for maneuver and firepower had brought us complete success. However, as observers informed us, new enemy forces took up positions east of Yeremivka. We had to believe that very soon they would attack. In the meantime, the 2nd SS Grenadier Motorized Division Reich struck in a southerly direction. It inflicted heavy losses on enemy troops south of Krasnograd. The division's forward tank units continued to advance southward, and at night, the units pursuing the retreating enemy succeeded each other until the advanced units of the division reached Novomoskovsk on February 20 at 14.00. There they established contact with the outposts of the Steinbauer Group units. The Luftwaffe supported the attacking groups with dive bomber raids on enemy resistance points, inflicting heavy losses on the Russian troops. They had already advanced to the west of the Krasnograd-Novomoskovsk road, but feeling the threat of encirclement, began to withdraw. Pavlograd became the next object of attack of the 2nd Grenadier Motorized Division Reich. The reason for this was the advance of large Soviet forces in the direction of the Dnieper, then south of Dnipropetrovsk through Sinelnikovo. After heavy fighting, the division joined up with XXXXVII Tank Corps, which was advancing on the Russian wedge from the south, east of Pavlograd. Regardless of what was happening south of Yeremivka, it was time to move into the Soviet concentration areas near Orelka and deliver a preemptive strike. I had comments when I briefed the unit commanders. I intended to move Wunsch's tank battalion northward, along with a company of mobile patrols and 2 companies of motorized infantry. These units would then turn east and break through to the Soviet concentration areas from the rear. The reconnaissance platoon was already scouting and mapping out the route. The movement was to be organized in such a way that we appeared in the rear of the enemy at dawn. And at that time, all the drivers of the wagon cars and infantrymen, supported by artillery, would make a false attack and divert the attention of the Russians in the western direction. Deep in the night, car after car lined up behind each other, waiting for the lead units to start moving. We pulled away slowly, moving in total darkness. Armored cars stopped at the turns, pointing the direction of the main column and providing cover at the same time. The roar of the tank's engines could barely be heard because of the high snow drifts. The column, like a giant snake, crawled forward to its goal, as if on 1,000 cats' paws. We were moving too fast, so fast that between two villages we had to wait for the right moment. The tanks stood up. Stopping the fighting vehicles close together, we waited for the dawn to break. Had we chosen the right position? What if we made a mistake and got lost somewhere? Had the enemy spotted us? Many what-if questions plagued me the whole time. Finally, I thought I could distinguish the outline of a tank following us. The tank was at a distance of 100 meters behind the forward units. This meant that there was already enough light to make a surprise attack. So the moment had come. Radio communication was switched on. I gave the artillerymen in Yeremivka the task to open fire, and everyone waited tensely for the first shots. Explosions of shells will indicate whether we've come to the right place. Yes, exactly to the right place. Our howitzer hit the Russian positions on our right. Blinding flashes flickered over the snow. The 20mm tracer shells of our armored vehicles' automatic cannons marked their targets. Machine guns and rifle shots rang out across the front, and mortars rumbled in the village. A forward artillery observer was watching the concentration of fire and directing it to the site of the planned breakthrough. We aimed at the area where the shells were bursting and could clearly see the effect they were having. We determined the location of the enemy artillery by the flashes from its barrels. The batteries were no more than 400 meters away. The Soviet troops had not yet noticed us. And now the moment has come. The tanks cut deep into the flanks of our enemy along a wide front and opened fire from a very close range. The enemy's anti-tank guns could not return fire. They were deeply echeloned and directed towards Yeremivka. For what purpose were they turned this way? The Soviet commander, who directed the arrangement of the anti-tank gun positions, did not think about the rear and flanks, and did not equip reserve positions. German infantry jumped off the vehicles and rushed into the houses, dragging out Soviet soldiers caught by surprise. Shots from tanks almost at point-blank range destroyed several trucks with Stalin's organs on them. Dangerous fireworks demonstrators flew up to the sky. The trucks were literally blown to pieces, small pieces of them sprinkled on us. The tank company was scouting in the eastern direction and came across heavy enemy artillery. The sappers blew up the guns. Street battles and house-to-house fighting were short and painless. It was as if the Soviet troops were paralyzed. They did not expect our attack. A Soviet division commander was killed while fleeing. His remains were found in an orchard. We fought our way forward from house to house. Suddenly, Obersturmführer, Brimmer's chief of staff, collapsed a few meters ahead of me. A Russian bullet that hit him in the stomach toppled him to the ground. A soldier who burst into a larger house warned us about snipers who were firing at us from attics through thatched roofs. A loyal soldier who ducked through the door collapsed with his head shot through. The house went up in flames. We immediately captured a staff officer. He was the chief of staff of a Soviet division. Within half an hour, the village was ours. Our artillery showed itself admirably. The rampart of fire collapsed in front of us like a crushing fist. No wonder we were grateful for it to the forward artillery observer, but he ended up in the thick of the retreating enemy. We broke about 2 kilometers deep into the enemy positions and completely dispersed the enemy. Black dots were scattering in disorder across the huge, snow-covered fields. The anti-tank guns were crumpled by our tanks. All Soviet guns were directed westward, toward Yeremivka, while the deadly blow fell upon them from the east. Dense, suffocating smoke stood over the village when, concluding the battle, the last shells whistled. The cars of the field hospital rolled westward. Our comrades who had fallen in battle lay in front of me on cloak tents. We said goodbye to them. Then they were put on the tanks. None of them were left behind by us. Their peace would not be disturbed. We had previously found that after our departure, the Russians had ravaged and destroyed German graves. The Russian staff officer made a good impression on us. We had to leave the house in a hurry, as the thatched roof had caught fire and was blazing like a torch. The lieutenant colonel readily answered all questions that were not directly related to the current operation. He had been sent to the front only a few days before after graduating from the Front's Academy in Moscow. Before sending the captured Russian officer to the division, each of us said goodbye to him. And he said, "We will win the war against Germany with American help. You are losing the war now, but one day we will be friends. We will continue to fight together and achieve the final victory." At about 3 p.m., the last tank left back to Yeremivka. Deeply shocked, I said goodbye to the mortally wounded SS Obersturmführer. On his face was already the seal of death when he asked me, "Can I go back to the battalion?" On the way to the field hospital, Bohr left us for good. The brutal cold forced us huddled together in the few surviving houses, and only the sentries had to endure the harsh conditions of the Russian winter outside. My soldiers suddenly gave vent to jubilation and surrounded me, shouting like savages. My hand ached from their shaking. In perfect amazement, I learned that I had been awarded oak leaves to the Knight's Cross. After the first astonishment, I left the house and looked for my fallen comrades. Not a sound was heard. The front was quiet. Only at a great distance bright flashes were visible. I could barely distinguish fresh graves. There were no crosses or stones marking the final resting places. The snow was tightly tamped down and barely stood out against the surroundings. Our comrades were not to be disturbed. We wanted to shield them from vandals. Snowflakes fell from the sky and covered the graves, which looked like deep wounds. The gloomy place disappeared. The merciful Lord had closed the scars. I felt no relief from this transformation. The soldier who had warned me about the Russian snipers that morning also rested here. Without his warning, I would probably be lying next to him by now. I was summoned to the Führer's headquarters, and 24 hours later, I flew from Poltava to Vinnytsia. The headquarters was characterized by its simplicity. The first thing I did was to ask to make a telephone call to my wife in Berlin. The call was made in a few minutes, and I felt the great joy of being able to talk to my wife and our children. After the phone call was completed, I was escorted to Adolf Hitler, who welcomed me warmly, presented me with an award, and invited me to sit down. For more than an hour, I listened to what efforts were being made on the home front and on the battlefields. The tragedy of Stalingrad, as it seemed to me, laid on the Führer a heavy burden, but I was relieved to note that, returning to the events surrounding the death of the Sixth Army, Hitler did not condemn any officer who fought at Stalingrad. The Führer was seriously concerned about the incessant air raids on Germany, and I had the feeling that he was particularly depressed by the suffering of the German civilian population. Hitler gave the impression of a physically fit man. His voice was calm, and his assessments of the situation at the front, realistic and very appropriate. He made no predictions, but he knew that the war would last a long time. He considered Churchill his most sworn enemy. For an hour no one disturbed us, and I had the opportunity to give him unvarnished information from the front. At the same time, I pointed out the lack of weapons and combat equipment. Adolf Hitler did not interrupt me. He patiently listened to all this, sometimes making notes. After the general meal, I sat with General Stieff and a few other officers, discussing the course of the war and how to conduct it further. I returned to Poltava after only 48 hours and boarded the Storch, which took me directly to division headquarters. Meanwhile, the fighting had taken a more favorable turn for us. During the offensive of the 2nd SS Grenadier Motorized Division, Reich from Krasnograd southward to Pavlograd, we defeated large enemy forces, especially the head formations. However, significant Russian forces remained in positions east of the Krasnograd-Novomoskovsk road. To eliminate this threat from the enemy and to establish contact with the division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, northeast of Krasnograd, we needed fresh forces. For this purpose, the SS Motorized Corps was assigned the long-awaited 3rd SS Motorized Division, Deadhead, which meanwhile was unloading from echelons near Poltava. The Russians were also pulling up fresh forces in the area in front of the Leibstandarte front. Parts and compounds of Popov's grouping had already been cut off by the First Army. which was operating on our right. However, the 5 tank corps of the Russians were still advancing westward on the front of the 4th Tank Army. The mild weather that had settled by February 20 was favorable to offensive operations. Most of the roads were free of snow, and this greatly increased the mobility of German tank and motorized units and formations. It was important not to let those enemy forces that were retreating to the northeast to avoid coverage. They had to be stopped and defeated. Attacking German divisions took advantage of the strike on a narrow front and provided strong cover for the flanks of the advancing groups. These attacking strikes were carried out with the active support of the Luftwaffe. The main path of the enemy's offensive, in the direction to the southwest, was cut, and its forward units and formations were in a difficult situation. Our units took Lozovaya at 14.00. In spite of this, our lines of communications and, consequently, the left flank of the army remained threatened by those shattered enemy forces, which were cut off from their own supply lines in the areas of the Samara and Oreli rivers. These enemy units had been ordered to withdraw and regroup in the area of Orelka, Lozovaya, and Paniutino, and were now breaking through to the east and northeast in small armor-reinforced groups. Other enemy units and formations from the area south of Pavlograd began to break through the next day to the north. One of these formations, supported by armored vehicles, struck the Corps' command post near Yurievka on February 28. Shortly thereafter, another large compound attacked the command post of the 15th Infantry Division at Orelka. On February 27, we reached our first objective. Popov's attacking mobile group was thwarted. It was prevented from achieving its objectives. Meanwhile, the division Leibstandart fulfilled its defensive mission. Despite the great width of the division's defense area, its assault groups inflicted heavy damage to the enemy by constant attacks, first on one flank and then on the other. The division stopped the enemy offensive at Poltava. Since February 28, the enemy regrouped its forces in front of the right flank of the division, Leibstandart. The Russians were pulling up 2 tank corps and 3 rifle divisions of their 3rd Tank Army from the area between the settlements of Lubotin and Valky in order to throw them against the SS motorized corps, and we had not yet established the area of their concentration. Now we had offensive tasks before us. The main strike was to the northeast. The first target was the line of uplands between Barica and Efremovka. Division Leibstandart Adolf Hitler attacked together with parts of Task Force Kempf. The 2nd SS Reich Motorized Division was advancing on March 1 along the road north of Krasnograd. The division continued the offensive on March 2 in the direction of the high ground near Starovorovka. To the right was the XXXXVII Panzer Corps, which took Barica on March 2. The 3rd SS Motorized Division, Deadhead, moved north, despite the great difficulties caused by the condition of the roads. Then, on March 2, it turned northeast to destroy the enemy units that were here, according to reports. Baum's battle group met fierce Russian resistance here. From the reports of March 2 and 3, it was possible to establish that the left flank of the division east of Yeremivka ran into the enemy forces moving into the area from the north. It became clear that the enemy failed to determine the direction of our offensive. He directed his regrouped units directly between the compounds of the attacking SS Motorized Corps and the front of the division, Leibstandart Adolf Hitler. As a result, the right flank of the 3rd SS Motorized Division, Deadhead, was turned inward. The division engaged the enemy while he was still just concentrating. The enemy tried to avoid being pinched by launching powerful counterattacks to the southeast and northeast. This was not successful. The main enemy forces were defeated by the 3rd SS Motorized Division, Deadhead, the southern wing of the Leibstandart, which attacked in an easterly direction, and units of the 2nd Reich Grenadier Motorized Division. The 3 divisions launched concentric attacks during 3 days of heavy fighting. U-82 Stuka dive bombers gave us air support and inflicted heavy damage on the enemy. Retreating enemy columns were broken up in the course of their pursuit. They posed a certain danger to our rear for several more days. A Soviet general commanding the XVI Guards Corps was found dead only a few hundred meters from the command post of the SS Motorized Corps. Taranovka and Akaki were taken by the 2nd SS Grenadier Reich Motorized Division by the evening of March 4 after a brutal battle. The Leibstandart Division joined the offensive from its positions northwest of Starovorovka and linked up with the 2nd Grenadier Motorized Division Reich. The 3rd SS Motorized Division Deadhead completed the defeat of the encircled enemy on March 5. The enemy's personnel losses were high, and the cauldron was littered with a large number of weapons and vehicles. In general, 2 tank corps and 3 rifle divisions could be considered destroyed. The Russian 3rd Tank Army was considerably weakened as a result of this battle. The 1st SS Grenadier Motorized Division, Leibstandart, which was again attached to the SS Motorized Corps, closed its lines after capturing the village of Staniki and regrouped for the offensive. By March 5, it occupied positions next to the 2nd SS Grenadier Reich Motorized Division at Karavansky. It entrenched itself on the line Stanichi, Vinnikov, Nikolskoye, Krutaya Balka. On the same day, the 3rd SS Motorized Division Deadhead was released and also reattached to the corps. Still favorable for the attack, the condition of the roads had deteriorated considerably, and the snow cover in the northern part of the area we had reached was still deep, preventing the rapid conduct of the operation. Should the offensive have been continued? Should Kharkov have been recaptured? Or should we continue to destroy the enemy forces in front of Task Force Kempf? The next target was to be the boundary of the Mija River. On March 6, the SS Motorized Corps began to advance towards the Mija River with the 2nd SS Grenadier Motorized Division Reich on the right, the 1st SS Grenadier Motorized Division, Leibstandart, on the left, and the 3rd SS Motorized Division, Deadhead, behind the left flank. The 2nd SS Grenadier Motorized Division, Reich, forced the enemy out of Novaya Vodolaga after a heady battle. The SS Grenadier Motorized Division, Leibstandart, reached the line Moskoltsovo, Leakovo, Gavrilovka, and one of its battalions broke through to the northern bank of the Mija. The heavily rugged terrain delayed our neighbor on the right, which nevertheless consolidated its right flank behind Taranovka and captured Borki. On the night of March 7, the 2nd Grenadier Motorized Division, Reich, reached the boundary of the Mija River, and the Grenadier Motorized Division, Leibstandart, increased its bridgehead on the northern bank. The weather had warmed, and the night frosts were no longer severe enough to keep the ground frozen. The condition of the roads became even more critical as a result of the snow and mud mixing together. Soldiers and combat vehicles were forced to operate at the limits of their capabilities. On the other hand, the Russians were showing signs of weakness. In the battles between the Donets and the Dnieper, they suffered heavy losses. They tried to counterattack the advancing SS Motorized Corps, but their forces were not enough for this. Our command faced a dilemma, whether to attack in the direction to the northwest, helping the offensive of Task Force Kempf, or to attack Kharkov. It was decided to continue the attacks to the north. On the morning of March 6, with my battle group, I was on the left flank of the division Leibstandart, where I received orders to attack in a northeastern direction and at the same time to cover the left flank of the division. The deep snow hampered all forward movement. The road could not be seen because of the snow, and sometimes one could only guess where it was. We slowly crawled up the rise to a small height from which we should have had a good view toward the northeast. A wide snowfield spread out before us. The small village, which was defended by Soviet troops, was 500 meters to the right. We could see the Red Army soldiers going about their business there, unaware of our whereabouts. In the distance we saw the squat houses of another village, and it was this village that I decided to make the first object of our attack. It was about 10 kilometers away. I ordered a group of tanks from Wunsch's battalion to destroy the first village. They were accompanied by motorized infantry. Tanks with a roar will rush to the village under cover of a fire screen of artillery and eliminate the threat to the flank of the task force. With my main forces, I wanted to attack the far village, thus breaking through to the rear of the Soviet troops. The unit commanders informed the soldiers about the situation and our intentions. Artillery and mortar battalions reported ready to open fire. My soldiers with and without binoculars surveyed the horizon for enemy troop movements. I leaned over the radiator and warmed my hands on the engine. The hands of my watch moved slowly forward. We put out our cigarette butts. The tank hatches slammed shut, and ready sounded in my ears. Only seconds separated us from the beginning of the artillery preparation. I raised my hand and looked at the companies once more, then lowered my hand down, and the first shots sounded. Our tank company moved slowly, heavily, and with a clang towards the village, and to the howl of our dive bombers attacked the enemy. Aircraft one after another from low altitude struck at selected targets. Under the hail of bombs and the fire of cannon and machine guns, the enemy was forced into the open countryside. When the last bomb fell, our first tank was already entering the village. Meanwhile, the battle group also started moving, trying to reach the target at full speed. However, the snow proved to be a much more serious obstacle than the enemy defending in the distant village. Huge snowdrifts towered in front of the tracks of the tanks. The tanks were struggling to make their way forward. After a short time, when self-propelled artillery units and amphibious vehicles stuck in the snow, I realized that we were without infantry support. The vehicles were climbing up through the tamped snow and landing on their bottoms, which threatened to upset our plan of attack. My armored car wedged itself between two Tigers, and we very slowly made our way forward. For a while we had to stop in a small depression and wait for the infantry to pull up. The soldiers climbed on the tanks, as the light reconnaissance vehicles could not cope with the snowdrifts. And then we set off again. To our left and behind us, the Russians defending the first village were retreating, coming under the murderous fire of our guns. When we came close to the second village, our leading units were stopped by the fire of anti-tank guns, but the Tigers with their powerful 88mm guns quickly dealt with the enemy anti-tank guns. A tank company under Jurgensen's command, under cover of several orchards, was approaching the village from the right flank. Our armored vehicle was hit by a 45mm cannon, which, however, missed. Unfortunately, we were unable to locate its firing position. We were now 200 meters from the village and looked out for a place to pass. Machine gun bursts rattled on the armor of my armored vehicle. The head Tiger ran over an anti-tank mine and remained standing with a torn-off track. A Russian T-34 tank appeared and entered the battle. But we had to enter the village. Suddenly, there was a monstrous explosion in my armored car, and, regaining consciousness, I found myself lying on the snow in a rut and looking at my driver, who was sitting behind the wheel without his head. A direct hit had caused a huge hole in the armor. SS Unterscharfer Albert Andres, stunned, staggered off to cover. I noticed with horror that he had only one arm. In place of the other arm was a mess of scraps of cloth and fragments of bone. Bremer's company had entered the village and was fighting its way down the street. Suddenly, on the way, we came across a Russian tank. It was set on fire by a satchel flamethrower. Only now I noticed that I had taken SS Obersturmführer Sanders' machine gun. My own had been left in the armored vehicle, which had been turned around by a Russian shell. Sander gratefully took back his weapon, and I used the Soviet rifle. The village was ours within the hour, and we immediately set up portable wire fences all around the perimeter. The short day inclined me to spend the night here. At dusk, we buried my driver, Ernst Nedelung. Liaison officers from the Grenadier Motorized Division, Greater Germany, reported to me on the actions of their division on our left. I was glad to see that a battle-hardened unit was operating north of us. An amazing thing happened that night with SS Obertarfer Begelsack. Good old Fritz felt the call of nature and accordingly looked for a suitable place. Satisfied that he had found a corner of the house protected from the wind, he set about his important business. But a man supposes, and Fritz was not alone. Opposite him sat a Russian lieutenant, who silently pointed a machine gun at him and for some time watched the matter of national importance. We suddenly heard a cry of horror, and in the rays of our flashlights was Fritz with his pants down to his ankles. Excitedly, but silently, he was pointing at his adversary. We had seldom laughed so hard before. It is also possible that the Russian had never before tasted a cigarette as delicious as the one Fritz Begelzak had treated him to. We met the next morning for an attack on the settlement of Valky, which was 10 kilometers from where we had lodged. Russian tanks and anti-tank guns tried to delay our advance, but we outflanked these pockets of resistance and destroyed them with an attack from the rear. During the attack on the last stronghold of Valky, SS Obersturmführer Reimling's fighting vehicle took a direct hit. Reimling had been awarded the Knight's Cross just a few days before. In the person of his crew, we lost brave comrades. After several fierce battles, I reached the Mija River near Valky while in Weiser's company. The bridge across the river was intact, but I did not believe the Russians and ordered an attack on the river ice. The bridge must have been mined. The company took position behind small houses and barns and held close to the river bank, preparing for the attack. From time to time, I noticed the head of some Russian on the other bank. Our tanks were behind us, and it was supposed that they would cover our rush across the ice with fire. Bremer's company had fallen behind and was dragging behind. I thought feverishly how best to get to the other bank and take Valky without bringing artillery and mortars into the battle. From the other bank came the clanking of tank tracks. The Russians were pulling up their T-34s. My young soldiers looked at me as if to say, "Listen, buddy, you're dragging us into shit again. Then you might want to think about how to get us out of it again." I think they thought it was funny that I was lying there like a big dog on a chain who can't get a bone and licks impotently. But here I realized what to do. The company, lightning fast, as if fired from a cannon, crossed the river on the ice and occupied the other bank. I rushed forward on the ice along with a section of the headquarters company. The crossing over the ice was almost effortless. The Russians did not fire a shot, but sat as if in a daze with their guns and yielded. What moved us to such a headlong rush? Well, something like this. Attention, please. The first one to reach the other side gets 3 weeks vacation. Let's go. I've never seen such a friendly start before or since. Then everything happened with lightning speed. Our tanks passed over the bridge, which by then was safe to pass. They marched forward through the streets and, supported by infantry, knocked out the remaining Russians. We overturned an enemy artillery battalion while it was still in firing positions and took several hundred prisoners. A few kilometers east of Valkov, we encountered Piper's motorized battalion. Company reconnaissance found the mangled bodies of 4 of our comrades. They had been stacked in a row and deliberately crushed by tank tracks. While my battalion rushed north, Piper reached the railroad junction of Schliich, where we rejoined on March 8. That same day, the Leibstandart Division advanced as far as the western outskirts of Kharkov. Despite the anti-tank defenses and counterattacks of the enemy, our offensive was no longer unstoppable. We wanted to retake Kharkov. The 3rd Motorized Division, Deadhead, which was advancing on our left, took Stary-Merchik, and its reconnaissance unit reached Olshin. The advance on the right of the 2nd Grenadier Motorized Division, Reich, was seriously hampered by the heavily rugged terrain. In addition, the threat to its flank from large enemy forces east of the Rekit-Neu-Luboten line forced the division to pull back significant forces to the east. On March 9, we reached the Udi River and took Olsztyny. Task Force Kempf was also rapidly advancing on its right flank. The final decision was dictated by the development of the situation. The goal was only one: Kharkov. That evening, the vanguard of the division, Leibstandart, had already reached the settlements of Pereseknaya on the Udi River and Polovaya on the Lopan River. It was decided to attack the city on March 10 with the SS Motorized Corps. The final orders were given on the evening of March 9. The attack was to be conducted in 3 directions, with the Leibstandart should attack from the north and northeast, and simultaneously with it from the west will strike the division Reich. Leibstandart was assigned the task of blocking the road to Chugev. The 3rd Motorized Division, Deadhead, was to cover us from enemy attacks from the northwest, from the front of Task Force Kempf, simultaneously advancing to the north and preventing the approach of enemy reserves. During the offensive, Witt's regiment reached the Kharkov-Belgorod road and advanced to the northern passage to Kharkov, where it encountered fierce resistance at the airfield. The enemy used civilians to build defenses. I contacted Fritz Witt on the road and learned that he intended to attack the airfield and then move on to the central square of the city. On Witt's right, the 2nd SS Motorized Infantry Regiment of the Leibstandarte Division, commanded by SS Tandern-Furwisch, was advancing. He also acted successfully. I suggested that in cooperation with Witt to send a combat group through the forests north of Kharkov and block the road Kharkov-Lutsk. Bremer's company was again ahead. We drove a few kilometers in the direction of Belgorod and turned east into the forests sunk in deep snow. The country road ended at a collective farm, and we spotted a Russian sentry withdrawing eastward. There was no question of turning back. I wanted to pass through the forest and thus penetrate into the eastern part of the city unexpectedly for the enemy. The forest road went through a forest of tall, slender trees. It ran past a small lake and then turned to the east. The scouts soon discovered several sleds pulled by draft oxen, which were hauling anti-tank and other guns. We had no more doubts. If sleds could pass through here, then tanks and other fighting vehicles must pass through. I ordered Bremer to move east and await further orders at the edge of the forest. The advance party under the command of SS Unterscharfer Stoll disappeared between the fir trees, leaving behind them a veil of snow dust. The 2 self-propelled guns followed, and very soon they were stuck on the slope. They slid from side to side and could drive off onto the ice of the frozen lake. With the help of the company soldiers, they barely got past this dangerous place. The forest road had to be cleaned up as quickly as possible to avoid a similar incident in the future. In a few minutes, hundreds of motorcyclists, infantrymen, and tankers were already making their way around the dangerous area. They chiseled through the frozen, hardened ground with shovels, crowbars, and axes, and we succeeded in it. Soon the marching column was on the road again. Bremer followed the front squad. The enemy cavalry were watching us from the snow-covered trees. The forest road was getting narrower and narrower. My armored vehicle was making its way right through the young fir and birch trees. We were followed by an 8-wheeled armored vehicle. The farther we went into the forest, the more doubts enveloped me. Could it be that I am again plunging the battle group into a hopeless situation? We could only move eastward. Not a single vehicle could turn around. We were surrounded on all sides by dense forest. I remembered Greece and the crossing to Patras, the attacks on the southern section of the Eastern Front, and the hard fighting we had been doing in the last few weeks. Despite almost hopeless situations, we kept fighting, which in the end allowed us to win no matter what. And that was also the case that day. No one would seriously consider that a motorized unit should advance through snowy forests. An academy student who would have proposed such a solution in peacetime would have been expelled and sent back to finish his service. The solution seemed absurd. Despite this, I believed in our victory. As it turned out, I was able to literally grab the Soviet troops by the throat when they were not at all ready to repel the attack. Frederick the Great used to say in such cases, "The more tricks and stratagems you use, the greater advantage you will have over the enemy." Max Wertinger could only slowly drive our armored car forward through the narrow passage. Snow piled up in the vehicle even after quite lightly touching branches. It was not the most pleasant ride. It was beginning to lighten up ahead. We passed through the forest and reached an open space that allowed us to part the narrow forest road. In amazement, I saw that Bremer had turned his vehicles around and gone into the woods. I crept toward Bremer and instinctively pressed myself into the ground as I cast a glance at the slope in front of us. Infantry, artillery, and a few tanks were moving toward Belgorod. In front of me was not a unit gripped by panic. On the contrary, it was a well-organized unit that was executing a tactical maneuver. It would be another hour before our entire task force would pass through the forest and be ready for combat. We should be satisfied with the fact that we have not yet been detected. A Soviet attack in such a situation would have resulted in our task force being destroyed. Our advantage in attacking and firepower would not be able to be realized. However, as mentioned, turning around was out of the question. Our unit should lie low and wait for a favorable moment to enter the battle. Perhaps the next day would bring with it a better opportunity for this. At any rate, it would be dark in an hour. At this point, our force consisted of 4 amphibious vehicles, a light armored car, and an 8-wheeled armored car. We had a total of 23 soldiers with 4 machine guns and personal pistols and rifles. This group of German soldiers watched the Russian marching column from a distance of about 800 meters. The column consisted of hundreds, if not more, of Soviet soldiers with all kinds of weapons. The terrain sloped slightly toward the road, and then gradually rose on the other side of the road. While the slope on our side was forested, the far slope appeared to be a snowy expanse stretching eastward where there was no cover. We stood motionless in our positions. Suddenly, we heard the increasing rumble of U-87 Stuka dive bombers. We couldn't see the planes yet, but they were approaching from the west, which meant they were coming with a full bomb load. Would they attack the Russian column moving in front of us? To our left was the village of Bolshaya Danilovka. The roar of engines sounded above us now. Shadows ran across the snowy expanse. We came out from behind the trees and stood like spectators in a theater who were offered a particularly interesting performance. Stukas flew over the column, described a great arc to gain altitude, and dive already from the south. Their bombs rained down, wreaking death and destruction. Horse-drawn sleighs rushed up the slope, and tanks exploded when bombs hit them directly. Any semblance of order disappeared in seconds. The horse-drawn sleighs were going off-road, and the entire far slope was dotted with countless black dots. It was the infantry fleeing. The Soviet troops were no longer under the control of their commanders. As if electrified, I stared at the disorderly mass of people, pulled out a rocket launcher and fired a red rocket into the air. Bremer immediately understood everything. Stoll's squad jumped into the vehicles and rushed down the slope. The machine guns of the armored communications vehicles were pounding the Soviets and covering us with their fire. We rushed down the field road with shouts and screams, against all conventional rules of warfare. Our horns and sirens made a hell of a racket. We were attacking a demoralized column. Red flares were still soaring high into the sky. The dive bombers recognized us. They waved their wings and swooped down on the fleeing mass of men, clearing the way for us with their guns. We reached the road. The Red Army men were throwing down their weapons. U-87s swept a few meters above our heads and flew around us in an unbroken chain. They took us under protection, covering us with fire. They howled along the road again and again, preventing the Russians from pulling up their troops. But now our armored car appeared at the edge of the forest, and its shells whistled northward. Here already Stoll's squad moved forward with the first tank. Here are 3 more tanks, and Max Wunsch reached the road. At this point, we were advancing on both sides. The Russians must have had the impression that this was a systematic, well-thought-out attack. We could not let them come to their senses. Soon hundreds of captured Soviet soldiers were gathered in the garden. We could not stop there. On the contrary, we had to take advantage of the effect of the dive bomber attacks and continue the offensive in the direction of Kharkov. Stoll's detachment, armored communications vehicles, and a few liaisons on motorcycles roared south toward the location of the Soviet units. The advance was covered by 2 tanks, one on each side of the road. Our U-87 friends had withdrawn. They were out of ammunition. The full impact of our savage raid was now in full view. The sky was calm again, and the nerve-wracking roar of the airplanes no longer hovered over us. We had broken through the Soviet column in a pair of laughing armored cars. Shells fired from the guns of our tanks whistled over us and exploded to the south. The Russians, who tried to refocus on the road after the bombers had flown away, came under our machine gun fire. The Soviets again fled for their lives. The enemy radio station remained on the road, and the radio operators came under our fire. The officers fled under the cover of a peasant's house, and we destroyed their communications vehicle with hand grenades. Fire and smoke showed us the way. Forward, and only forward. I was afraid to stop. All our strength was in movement. Our extremely high speed, the killing power of machine guns, grenades thrown on the move, and the rumble of gunshots of our tanks led to the fact that the Soviet troops in a great hurry to get off the road, moving south to the city. Our advancing column stopped at a brick wall on the northern outskirts of Kharkov. I spotted at least 5 or 6 tanks in the gardens on either side of the road just in time. On our left, the crew of a Russian tank was busy removing the camouflage covering from their T-34. Machine gun fire forced the tankers to lie down. The firing drove the rest of the tank crews out of the houses as well. No one had expected a German offensive in this location. Despite this, the situation was becoming dangerous for us. Stoll barely had time to jump into another vehicle when his car stopped. I saw Stoll's driver disappear into a haystack. The first Russian tanks were coming into firing position. We had to retreat. We had to get out of here as soon as possible, or we would be under fire from the Soviet tanks. Before that, we had traveled more than 7 kilometers to the south. Behind me sat a captured Russian major wounded in the stomach. I admired the man. All the way back, I did not hear a word of complaint from him about his pain. Dr. Guttering gave him the first dressing of his wound. When we got back to Bolshaya Danilovka, we found a large number of prisoners guarded by only a few of our soldiers. None of the prisoners tried to escape. It seemed to me that they were glad of the lot that had fallen to them. By midnight, a large part of the battle group was still missing, but during the few hours of darkness it pulled up in separate small units. The entire unit had reassembled by 5 o'clock, and the battle group was once again ready for combat. As soon as the first dim light of the new day dawned, we were already advancing southward towards Kharkov again. However, this time the offensive was not so fast. We rolled southward, carefully inspecting the terrain around us. In the distance on the right, we saw Soviet troops attacking the airfield. They were operating against Witt's regiment. In front of us, we noticed attacking Soviet infantry, which lay as if nailed to the ground, under machine gun fire. Soon we approached the brick wall again and found Stoll's driver unharmed. Bruno Prager had slept in a haystack all night. The enemy tanks were still in firing positions. 5 T-34s fell victim to our tanks and soon burst into flames. A TIV received a direct hit and, exploding, blew to pieces. The enemy tank that destroyed it fired a direct hit on my vehicle from a distance of less than 50 meters. The Russian shell hit killed my driver, Max Wertinger, instantly. The commander of our communications platoon, Heinz Westphal, was also hit by a shell. Helmut Belk was wounded, and I lay unharmed under Max Wertinger's body. The Russian tank had fled. We fought our way forward, taking house after house. The Russian anti-tank gun crew was killed by a fallen lamppost. Our tanks dominated the battlefield. SS Corps had an overwhelming numerical superiority in tanks. Ed. Toward the evening of March 11, we stood in the eastern part of Kharkov, having reached the road to Stary Saltov. At the moment of our victory, a dangerous crisis was revealed. Our tanks had only a small amount of fuel in reserve and could no longer be thrown into battle. The tanks were assembled in a large cemetery where they took up a circular defense, forming a sort of bastion in the center of Kharkov. From here, we sent our scouts along the Kharkov-Chuviv road and tried to block this main route of retreat of the Russians from Kharkov. For several hours, I had no report from the 2nd Company of the 1st SS Reconnaissance Battalion. It had been cut off by the enemy in the area of the river port in Kharkov. Bremer's company was fighting for its life, and Olbuter was repulsing enemy attacks from the east. In the cemetery, we had to defend ourselves against Soviet troops trying to break through. As darkness fell, SS Hauptsturmführer SS Bruckmann managed to deliver fuel for tanks and armored vehicles, but at the same time he reported that the road was blocked by enemy troops. Witt's regiment broke into the city in a surprise attack from the north. It made its way to the city's central square in heavy street fighting and took up defensive positions there for the night. On March 12, the task force passed several blocks and then blocked the road to Chugev. Here it was the Soviet troops' turn to attack us. They wanted to overturn us. We concentrated in a small area. 2 platoons of Weiser's company, which were on the second floor of the school, were cut off and desperately defended, holding off the onslaught of the attacking Russian troops who had made their way to the first floor. An immediate counterattack under Wunsch's command succeeded in destroying the Russians who were storming. Once again, the entire battle group found itself surrounded and engaged in a desperate fight. The circle of burning buildings accurately indicated our location in this sector of the city. As night fell, I no longer had much hope that we could hold out until the next morning. The enemy was within throwing distance of a hand grenade. As we walked through our positions, we suddenly noticed a Russian tank pulling up and standing in front of the school building. We were less than 20 meters away from it when the tank commander leaned out of the hatch trying to make contact with the Russian infantryman. He was killed by a shot from a Weiser pistol. The tank moved away, tracks clanking, with the dead commander's body hanging powerlessly from the turret, half out of it. On the night of March 12, the 2nd Grenadier Motorized Division, Reich, broke through the anti-tank ditch on the western outskirts of Kharkov and thus paved the way into the city. During the day, the division made its way to the railroad station. The enemy was trying to break out of the encirclement. Everywhere he put up stubborn resistance and attacked us from the northeast of the city. Jochen Piper was making his way to us in 2 armored motorized infantry carriers to make contact with the main forces of the division. One of the armored personnel carriers was hit by a shot from a T-34 tank, but Piper managed to get the men out. We fought fiercely and persistently for every house until March 14. By about 6 p.m., we had captured the last 2 sectors of the city to the east and southeast. The tractor factory was captured on March 15. That same morning, the 3rd SS Motorized Division, Deadhead, reached the narrow passages near Chugev and sealed them off after successful tank battles north of Rogani. The cordon had to be maintained for the next few days, holding off enemy attempts to break through and counterattack from the east. We managed to destroy most of the surrounded enemy's manpower and equipment. Thus, a decisive counteroffensive in response to the Russian winter offensive was completed. The front in the section of Army Group South stabilized. The Russian offensive power was largely undermined, and the remnants of the forces were badly damaged. In pursuit of the enemy, retreating to the east and north, in the following days German troops came to the Seversky Donets, and completing the offensive of the SS Motorized Corps, on March 18, Jochen Piper took Belgorod. At Belgorod, there was a connection with the advancing westward parts of the Motorized Division, Greater Germany. During the last few days in a heavy tank battle near Graveren, it destroyed up to 150 Soviet tanks. The battle for Kharkov was victoriously concluded despite heavy losses. In the great battle between the Donets and the Dnieper, the German grenadiers came out victorious over the eastern hordes. Shortly before the summer offensive, I had to bid farewell forever to the loyal grenadiers I had commanded for many years. I shall never forget parting with my comrades. I was seconded to the tank school and then transferred to the 12th SS Tank Division, Hitler Youth. 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitler Youth. It was destined to be a unique phenomenon in the history of warfare that a division, especially of such a complex organization as the modern tank division, should consist, with the exception of officers and non-commissioned officers, entirely of young men of 17 and 18 years of age. Anyone in Germany who had any understanding of warfare, who had educated or supervised young men, was of the opinion that the use in combat of such a formation could only lead to disaster in the first few days. It was believed that such young soldiers would not be able to withstand for long the physical and moral strains of modern warfare. This opinion was even more strongly shared at the time by our adversaries. And it was not just enemy wartime propaganda. When leaflets and radio programs spoke of a children's division, whose emblem was supposed to be a bottle of baby food. But the way these young men proved themselves in battle, and the way the 12th Armored Division acted debunks the critics. Thus, it seems important to me to briefly dwell on how the division was created. This is necessary to satisfy the reader's interest both in general cognitive and in concrete historical terms. When, after the catastrophe at Stalingrad, Goebbels announced total war, a plan was put forward to create a volunteer division of young men fit for military service. They were to be a symbol of the willingness of German youth to make sacrifices and an expression of their will to realize it. These young men of 17 to 18 years of age were prepared for service through accelerated military training, proving that it was worth something. Such a division would, among other things, help to attract young men of this age to other German divisions in order to compensate for the huge losses in personnel suffered in the Russian campaign, and also in order to greatly increase German military strength. The previous commanders of these young men felt that the usual methods used in training soldiers were not suitable for them. Therefore, in this special division they wanted to try out their new methods. Following discussions between Reichsjugendführer Axmann and Adolf Hitler on this matter, the appropriate orders were issued by Hitler in June 1943. The Hitler Youth Organization was to call for volunteers and train them in military training camps. They were then to be transferred to the newly created Waffen-SS Division. The 1st Motorized Division, Leibstandarte, was assigned the task of supplying command cadres for the new division. Together with the division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, this new division, which became known as the Grenadier Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, was to form the ISS Panzer Corps. The formation of the Hitlerjugend Division was to begin immediately. While the recruitment of the Hitler Youth was underway and the training of its personnel began, the Leibstandarte Division was in the process of selecting the command staff for the new division. In the battles during the withdrawal from Kharkov and the subsequent retaking of this city, the division Leibstandarte suffered heavy losses. It was preparing for Operation Citadel, the purpose of which was to destroy the Russian troops on the front near Kursk. Command of the new division was entrusted to the commander of the 1st SS Grenadier Tank Regiment. 35-year-old SS Standartenführer Witt awarded oak leaves to the Knight's Cross. He took several officers from his regiment with him. Their places were taken by officers from the 2nd SS Grenadier Tank Regiment. Other units of the Leibstandarte Division were to similarly provide cadres from their personnel to be transferred to the new division. The transferred soldiers, the core of the Hitler Youth Division, formed only its incomplete skeleton. The new division was extremely short of company commanders, platoon commanders, and squad leaders. Quite often young platoon commanders had to be assigned to command companies. Later, about 50 regular army officers, who at one time were leaders of the Hitler Youth Organization, were transferred to the division of the same name. To make up for the shortage of squad leaders, selected young men were sent to the non-commissioned officer school in Lauenburg immediately after their training in military camps. A few weeks after the start of basic training, suitable young men were selected for a 3-month non-commissioned officer training course within the division itself. When the first 10,000 young men arrived in July and August at the camp of the forming division in Belgium, not everything had been prepared for them. In particular, they could not immediately be issued uniforms. Nevertheless, combat training began immediately. Gradually, individual units were formed, in accordance with the schedule of their organization and equipment with combat equipment. All appointments to officer and non-commissioned officer positions were completed during September. As a result of the great effort expended, the training unit was transformed into a tank division. By this time, the 12th SS Tank Regiment, the formation of which took place in Mailkon near Reims, had 4 TIV and 4 TV Panther tanks for training purposes. Half of them secretly brought from the Eastern Front. The 12th SS Artillery Regiment in the division had at its disposal only a few light field howitzers. There were almost no transport vehicles at all. In November and December 1943, Italian vehicles appeared. The vehicle fleet then amounted to 80% of the officially authorized number. At the same time, the first tractors and armored vehicles arrived. Interactions between command and control in the division were difficult. In matters of training, the division was under the purview of the commander of tank forces in the West, General of Tank Forces Georg von Schweppenberg. Tactically, it was subordinate to the 15th Army. After the basic military training of the personnel was mostly completed, in the beginning of 1944, the combat training began under near-combat conditions. After the 12th SS Tank Regiment was transferred to the Hasselt area in Belgium, larger tank exercises were held here. Emphasis was placed on operations involving different branches of the Army. In February 1944, the 1st Battalion of the 25th SS Grenadier Tank Regiment took part in an exercise with live shells and ammunition in the presence of Colonel General Guderian, the Chief Inspector of Armored Forces. In March, the Commander-in-Chief of the forces in the West, General Feldmarschall von Rundstedt, attended the exercises of the various branches of the Army. On both occasions, the level of training in the division was approved. The coherence of the headquarters was tested in numerous radio communication sessions. One of these took place under the direction of the Corps Command in the area of Dieppe. During the exercise, there were so many difficulties with the Italian vehicles, which were totally unsuitable for us, that in the end the High Command instructed us to replace them with German military vehicles. Most of the young men joined our division, showing all the enthusiasm inherent in youth. They were eager to show themselves in action. Enthusiasm had to be maintained as core values, and where they were lacking, they had to be awakened. Since the young men were still developing, the principles and forms of training had to be somewhat different from those used in the training and education of other recruits. Many of the generally accepted principles of military training were replaced by new ones which, when all was said and done, were born from the bowels of the German youth movement, which had been born at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. There was no obvious superior-subordinate relationship, recognizing only orders and unconditional obedience. Relationships between officers, sergeants, and soldiers of other ranks were formed as relations between older and more experienced soldiers and green newcomers. The authority of the officer lay in being a role model and mentor to the younger soldiers. Officers tried to replicate relationships similar to those of a family. Young men were taught to take responsibility, to be ready to sacrifice, not to be afraid to make a decision, to be disciplined, to instill in them a sense of teamwork and camaraderie. If officers saw that their young subordinates were already showing these qualities, they were taught further. The division leadership was convinced that the young soldiers would achieve more if they were imbued with the understanding and necessity of the task at hand and correctly understood their role in it. Thus, the usual operational procedure was to analyze the orders received, based on a comprehensive assessment of the situation. The training of personnel avoided mush and ceremonialism. Everything was focused on combat training, and this process took place in conditions as close as possible to those of actual combat. Physical hardening was achieved through sports. Forced marching was not approved and was considered unnecessary and harmful. The art of marksmanship was perfected on the basis of the instruction of General Georg von Schweppenberg of the Panzer Forces. These training sessions took place exclusively in the field. No training firing was conducted at the regular garrison firing ranges. On the instructions of Chief Inspector Guderian of the Tank Forces, representatives of our division participated with officers of the Tank Forces School in Bergen in the development of new gunnery techniques for motorized grenadiers, which appeared in the spring of 1944. The infantry troops inspectorate rejected them. Based on the installation of General von Schweppenberg of the Tank Forces, special emphasis was placed on camouflage and silent movements, as well as ensuring the safety of communications, maintaining secrecy. And most importantly, the combat training was to be conducted day and night, in conditions close to combat conditions, including, in particular, the practice of close combat techniques. To intercept enemy radio conversations, the division received a reconnaissance communications platoon. Later, this platoon proved itself perfectly in the course of combat operations. Based on the guidelines of General von Schweppenberg's armored forces, the tactical exercises to lead the troops practiced actions in a wide variety of situations that involved offensive operations and actions against enemy airborne troops. Since the young men still had a growing body, and they were not well fed at home under the conditions of the war, they were given additional rations over and above the Army food ration. Therefore, they developed well physically in the division. Those who were less than 18 years old were not entitled to any cigarettes. Instead, they were given candy. There is no reason to believe that the division had any privileges in equipping it with weapons and military equipment. This should already be clear from the above. Everything had to be reclaimed with great difficulty. The organization of the division, like all Waffen-SS tank divisions, differed from the Army tank divisions only in that our tank regiment had 3 tank battalions, not 2. Unlike the tank training division, it had only 1 battalion of motorized infantry on armored personnel carriers. On the basis of the training received and the instructions given in accordance with the fundamental principles outlined here, of course, they are not set forth in detail in the book. Our soldiers went into battle inspired by the idea that their participation in combat would be decisive for the defense of Germany and for its ultimate victory. They were imbued with the belief that Germany's cause was just and that justice was on her side. The young soldiers went to war superbly prepared. Few divisions were trained to such a high level. Thus, their participation in the fighting was well justified.